The first man arrived before sunrise with blood on his cuff and a little girl asleep against his chest, and Eleanor Vale took one look at his empty holster, his river mud boots, and the fear he was trying not to show, and opened the door before he could ask. "Kitchen first," she said. "Bleeding later." He stepped into the warmth of Red House boarding as though warmth itself had become a thing he no longer trusted. The child clung to him without waking. Outside, Willow Trace Creek hissed in the dark, cottonwoods rattled in the wind, and somewhere near the empty livery a horse blew hard through its nose as if it had run all night on terror alone. Before we go any further, settle in wherever you are tonight. If you feel like it, tell us in the comments where you're listening from: Texas, Yorkshire, Alberta, Queensland, Georgia, wherever your lamp is burning. There is something comforting about knowing who is gathered at the same fire. By the time the stove had taken the chill off him, the child was asleep on a settle with a crust of bread in her hand, and the stranger sat at Eleanor's scrubbed pine table while she unwrapped the strip of cloth around his forearm. Knife cut, deep but clean. He watched the window while she worked. "That sort of looking," she said, rinsing pink water from the rag, "belongs to folks who think the dark has intentions. Dark usually does." His voice was low and rough from cold and weariness. Not old, not young, broad-shouldered, gone lean with hunger, jaw scarred, eyes carrying the flat, alert watchfulness of a man who had lived too long in bad country. The house above them shifted and creaked. Eleanor knew every footstep Red House made. Mrs. Dalrymple coughed at dawn like a broken clock. Ruth Mercer stitched children's clothes no child in the house wore. Mr. Bell kept his valise locked. Jonas Pike claimed to be a preacher, though his hands said otherwise. Every one of them had arrived with little luggage and too much caution. Red House boarding stood at the edge of Mercy Bluff, Colorado, where the road narrowed, the mountains began, and decent people often became private people. Travelers said Eleanor's food was plain, her rooms clean, and her questions mercifully few. Women traveling alone said something better, that the widow running the place knew when not to ask at all. "Your daughter?" Eleanor asked, nodding the fresh bandage. The pause before his answer told her more than the answer did. No, that was her first question. The second came when she held out the revolver she had taken from him, and he did not reach for it. "You keep it," he said. "Why?" "Because if they followed me here, they'll expect a man to answer the door." Upstairs, a floorboard sounded beneath some listening foot. "Who followed you?" Eleanor asked. "The kind who call a child property." That narrowed nothing in the west, but it was enough. She took a key from the tin by the pantry. "Room 7. Last door on the left. The little one can take the truckle. Breakfast at 6. No stealing from my pantry. No fighting on my stairs. And if trouble comes, you tell me before it reaches my front porch." He closed his hand around the key. Elias Rourke. "Is that true?" He looked at the sleeping child. "True enough for tonight." At breakfast, Mercy Bluff learned there was a new guest without learning much else. The child said her name was May. Elias said he was taking her to kin. Bell asked where. Eleanor set down the coffee pot hard enough to make him reconsider the wisdom of curiosity. "All of you paid for breakfast," she said. Not a deposition. There were small smiles around the table. Thin ones. Secretive ones. Even in daylight, the room held the feeling of people sitting near packed trunks. Around noon, another guest arrived in a yellow hired wagon with one trunk, 2 hat boxes, and the posture of a woman who had learned not to bend. She gave the name Viola Henshaw, widow, and asked only whether the doors locked from the inside. When Eleanor helped her upstairs, she saw the finger-shaped bruise beneath the woman's glove. That evening, after dishes were done and the boarders had gone quiet, Eleanor stood on the back porch and watched the mountains darken into one long iron edge. The air smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. Upstairs, May laughed softly for the first time, and the sound startled Eleanor after too much winter. Elias stepped onto the porch behind her. "You walk too quiet," she said. "You stand too exposed. I run a boarding house, not a fort. Some days that may be the same thing." She folded her arms against the cold. "You plan to explain why armed men might come looking for a child?" He was silent long enough that she thought he would lie. Instead, he said, "Men 2 towns east asked if I'd seen a woman named Anna Ketteridge. They had a photograph. Said she'd stolen from her husband." Eleanor did not move. And photographs don't always survive fires." She turned to face him. "My husband never used my maiden name unless he was angry. So they were yours. My dead husband's brother, more likely. Silas Vale has been trying to pry this house out of my hands since Nathan was buried. Says a woman can't manage property alone. What he means is he sees 20 rooms, a spring house, and land near a rail line he'd enjoy stealing. Why stay? Because that was how men asked the question. As though roots were foolishness. As though grief should travel light. Because my children are buried on the hill above town, she said, and my husband below them, and I'm not giving another inch of my life to a man named Vale. Rufus raised his head and growled toward the road. 3 riders waited at the gate. They did not dismount. Moonlight caught on silver conchos and rifle barrels. Evening, Mrs. Vale, the lead rider called. Been a spell. Silas, what do you want? Eleanor asked. Family business. Heard tell a wounded man and a child passed this way. Thought I'd spare you the trouble. Elias went still beside her. Keep riding. Silas laughed. And who might you be? Nobody that belongs to you. Silas's gaze lifted to the windows where curtains stirred. Morning, then, he said to Eleanor. Law's closer to me than it is to you. He rode off with the other 2 at his back. When the hoofbeats had faded, Eleanor looked at Elias. His hand was trembling, not with fear, but with anger held too hard. You know him? She asked. I know the kind. By breakfast the next day, Mercy Bluff had already done what little towns do best. Word traveled faster than honesty. Silas meant to petition the sheriff, inspect the boarding house, seize the child, and begin proceedings to take Eleanor's property. Half the town disliked the idea. Most disliked opposing Vale money more. Mrs. Dalrymple advised caution. Let them search. Clear the air. Bell suggested everybody keep to their rooms and avoid involvement in local matters. Jonas Pike offered something about the Lord defending the righteous while expecting them to exercise common sense. Only Ruth Mercer spoke plainly. She hemmed a child's sleeve at the table and said, Predators count on being obeyed the first time. After that, things get expensive for them. Eleanor had a choice. She could send Elias and the girl away before dusk, let Silas search empty rooms, save the business, and keep Red House respectable in the eyes of town. Or she could keep them, risk the deed, risk the house, risk the graves up on the hill, and defy the man who had spent years mistaking grief for weakness. The easy answer sat there between the bread knife and the coffee pot. Elias found her behind the house with damp sheets snapping on the line. We'll leave tonight, he said. You'll do no such thing. Silas comes with law next time. Silas comes with whatever men he can rent into agreement. This isn't your fight. At that she turned and looked at him until he had the good sense to regret the sentence. A man threatens my home and asks for my obedience, she said. Explain to me how that becomes someone else's fight. He rubbed a hand across his face. Then, perhaps because there was no point lying to a woman who had already seen through half of him, he said, the child's name isn't May. Eleanor waited. She's Miriam Dunn. Her father kept books for the San Jacinto Mining Company outside Leadville. He found records, stolen wages, dead miners left on payroll, land bought under false names. He meant to take copies to a federal marshal in Denver. He was killed before he got clear. Miriam's mother hid the real ledgers on the child and paid me to get her north. And her mother? He looked away. The clothespin in Eleanor's hand cracked in 2. So that's what they're hunting, she said. Not the child. The proof. Yes. And you carried her here. I didn't know where else to go. Neither did he say that he had seen something in Red House that felt safer than church, station, or camp. He did not need to. She stays, Eleanor said. You heard me wrong. No, I heard you right. She stays. He stepped closer, voice lowered by urgency. You don't know what kind of men this brings down on you. Her own voice dropped until it was quieter than his and harder. You don't know what kind was already here. Then the truth of her own wound came out. Not all at once, but enough. Nathan Vale had died 3 years earlier after drinking his way through debt and temper. Before that he had taught his brother that Eleanor could be leaned on, frightened, corrected. The children had taken fever one winter and left her with 2 graves and a silence no room ever seemed to fill. Silas had mistaken bereavement for softness. Grief didn't make me weak, she said. It made me finished with obedience. That was the harder choice. The one that cost her safety. The one that proved who she was. By afternoon, the whole town was weighing itself. Mrs. Keene from the bakery sent over bread and a warning that Silas had been drinking before noon. The barber's wife crossed the street rather than greet Eleanor. Sheriff Tom Corder came by with his hat in his hands and discomfort all over his face. Silas says you're harboring stolen property. A child is not property. He says he has guardianship papers. From a murdered father to a murdered mother to the man profiting from both. Corder lowered his voice. There are bigger men in this than Silas. Then you might try being a bigger sheriff. He left with his shame dragging behind him. That night Viola Henshaw came into the kitchen after supper and removed her gloves. My husband isn't dead, she said. I left with a copy of his private account book. Ruth Mercer appeared in the doorway with her sewing basket. Men like Silas don't act alone, she said. They borrow respectability from each other. Eleanor looked at her. And what are you hiding from, Miss Mercer? Ruth set down the basket. A husband who quoted scripture while breaking my ribs. Last winter I corrected him with a fireplace shovel. Belle, pale from the hall, finally entered. I was never in feed. I saw forged deeds, and one bore the name Vale. Jonas Pike came down the back stair with a revolver tucked in his waistband. Never preached a sermon in my life, he said. Used to ride shotgun for Wells Fargo. I know Silas's men. The room went still. Eleanor looked from face to face and understood, all at once, what Red House had become. Not merely a boarding house. A shoreline. The place hunted people stumbled toward when they had nowhere left to stand. Every single guest was hiding from someone. If you had been in her place, with the wolves already circling and half your household made of fugitives, what would you have done? Would you have sent them away to save yourself? Or locked the doors and dared the wolves to come closer? They made their bargain that night in the kitchen. Belle had copied papers linking railroad shell purchases to Vale interests. Viola had names and payoffs. Ruth had a cousin in Denver connected to a federal clerk. Elias had Miriam and the evidence sewn into the hem of her under petticoat. Jonah had a rifle and the useful habit of not missing. Eleanor had the house. And the house, it turned out, was enough. She knew every blind corner, every squealing hinge, every board that sang under boots, and every one that stayed quiet. Men entered houses run by women with fatal confidence. Eleanor planned to make that confidence expensive. Before dawn, Ruth unpicked the hem of Miriam's petticoat and drew out 2 oilskin-wrapped ledgers no bigger than hymnals. The child watched with solemn eyes. Your mama told you to guard them? Eleanor asked. Miriam nodded. And you did. The little chin lifted. I always do what she says. Eleanor laid a hand over the child's fist. Then today what she would say is this. Let the grown folks carry it for a while. For the first time, Miriam leaned into someone. By mid-morning, Silas arrived with 4 riders and Sheriff Corder behind them, looking like a man who hated his own reflection. Mercy Bluff collected across the road in 2s and 3s with baskets, hats, and invented errands. Towns love morality when it can be watched from a safe distance. Silas dismounted smiling. Morning, Anna. Eleanor. Sheriff's here lawful. We'll look around, take the child, and spare everybody gossip. No. Corder cleared his throat. Mrs. Vale, if you refuse. I do refuse. Read the writ aloud, Sheriff. If law is with him, let Mercy Bluff hear exactly what sort. Silas's smile tightened. There was a writ. There was very little law inside it. Corder unfolded the paper and read in a shaky voice. Emergency inspection, suspicion of stolen dependent, property review pending male family advisement. It sounded meaner than legal and thinner than both. Viola stepped onto the porch beside Eleanor in her proper hat. My father practices law in Boston, she said pleasantly. He would call that a child's forgery with delusions. Belle joined them with a ledger under his arm. Ruth came next. Then Jonah's rifle appeared in the upstairs window. Finally, Elias stood just inside the door with Miriam behind him, where Silas could see the outline of the child but not reach her. The townspeople began to murmur. Silas had come expecting one widow. He found a wall. The girl comes with me, he said. From the doorway, small and clear, Miriam answered, no. Every head turned. She stepped forward enough for them to see her ribbon, her scraped hands, the terrible steadiness in her face. You killed my pa? Silas went pale, then red. That's a lie. It isn't. Mama said if they got us, remember the red book. Red means blood. One rider moved for the porch. Jonah's rifle clicked. The man stopped. Then it happened fast. Silas lunged for the child. Elias hit him at the steps and drove him hard into the rail. One rider drew. Ruth kicked the door wide so the wood smashed his wrist and sent the shot harmless into the sky. Viola snatched the fallen revolver and leveled it with both shaking hands. Bell, to his own astonishment, tripped another man down the steps. Sheriff Corder shouted for calm in a tone no one respected. Silas twisted free and slammed an elbow into Elias's wound. Elias staggered. Miriam froze. Corder hesitated. Years of being underestimated converged into one clean instant. Eleanor seized the cast-iron wash boiler from the porch, heaved it with both hands, and dumped the near-scalding water into the dust at Silas's boots. Steam burst up. His horse reared. He stumbled blind and cursing. Elias took him low. Jonah fired once from the window and shattered the stock of the nearest rifle without taking the man's hand. Viola kept the revolver on Corder. "You may be sheriff now," she said, "or you may be furniture. Decide quickly." Something in him finally rose to meet the badge. He turned his pistol on Silas's riders. "Drop them." This time they did. Silas, muddy and coughing, glared up from where Elias pinned him against the post. "You think this house saves you?" he rasped at Eleanor. "It was always going to be mine." She came down the steps until they were eye to eye. "No," she said softly. "That was your mistake. You kept thinking ownership and deserving were the same thing." Then the proof came into daylight. Bell produced the copied transfers. Viola brought the account book. Ruth had the telegram ready for Denver. And little Miriam, with both hands and the courage of the dead behind her, carried out the red ledger that would ruin richer men than Silas ever hoped to be. The revelation did what gunfire could not. In front of Mercy Bluff, under a clear white noon, the whole ugly shape of it appeared. Forged deeds, dead miners still drawing wages, widows dispossessed, children hunted because they could identify signatures. Silas was not the whole storm. He was only the local face of it. And faces, unlike storms, could be named. By sundown, he was in a cell with 2 riders beside him and Corder riding for the telegraph office himself. That night Red House breathed like a body after fever. Bell shook over his coffee. Jonah cleaned his rifle on the porch. Ruth braided Miriam's hair with extraordinary gentleness. Elias was in the kitchen trying to stack wood one-handed and making a poor job of it. "You men," Eleanor said, taking the armful from him, "will bleed to death before admitting chairs were invented for your benefit." He sat because he was too tired not to. For a while there was only stove crackle and the smell of reheated coffee. Outside, the creek ran black under moonlight. Then Elias said, without looking at her, "I failed once." She waited. "My wife and son. Spring crossing. I judged the river wrong. Horse panicked. I got hold of one and lost the other, then lost both." He stared at his hands as if they still belonged to the man on that riverbank. "Since then I've taken work carrying other people to safety. It doesn't change anything. But I keep trying." There it was. His real wound. "And you?" he asked. Eleanor leaned back against the table. "Nathan drank what goodness he had. The children took fever. Afterward people praised me for surviving as though survival were a talent and not just what happens when chores still need doing." She looked into the stove. "Some days I think the loneliest thing in the world is being called strong by people who never asked how much it cost." He raised his head then. "That," he said quietly, "is the truest thing I've heard in years." When she re-wrapped his arm, his hand closed around her wrist for only a second, not to stop her, but to steady himself. She did not pull away. "I don't know what comes next," he said. "Neither do I. Does that frighten you?" "Not half so much as knowing exactly what comes next and hating every inch of it." He laughed, tired and real, and something in the room loosened. "If this story is moving you, you are exactly who we tell these tales for." A like and a subscribe tells us to keep the lantern lit for more of them. A little later Miriam came in with her blanket dragging behind her and climbed onto the bench between them. She laid her head on Elias's good shoulder and looked at Eleanor. "Mama used to say home isn't always where you started," she murmured. "Sometimes it's where you finally stop being scared." Ruth, pausing unseen at the doorway, made the faintest sound like a swallowed sob. Warmth had entered the house. Safety had not. Federal men arrived 2 days later. Then company lawyers. Then a polished attorney from Denver who smiled like a blade and asked whether Eleanor truly understood the gravity of accusing respectable businessmen. Eleanor understood it well enough to keep her eyes on his and answer, "Respectable men don't hunt children." The final battle wore a courtroom face, but its soul had already been decided on Eleanor's porch. 3 weeks later, the hearing in Cannon City drew ranchers, miners, wives, and newspapermen from 40 miles around. Eleanor wore plain dark wool. Viola wore lavender. Belle sweated through his collar. Ruth held Miriam's hand. Elias sat behind them, hat in his lap. Silas entered in shackles, shaved, furious, and somehow smaller, as if confinement had taken not his size but his certainty. The ledgers were read aloud. Belle matched them to the forged transfers. Viola named the bribes and the hotel rooms where money changed hands. Porter testified about the armed seizure attempt. Murmurs spread through the courtroom like wind through dry grass. Silas made one last try at cruelty. He pointed at Eleanor and called her a bitter woman too proud to keep a husband and too barren to keep a family. The words hung there ugly and old. Eleanor rose before her lawyer could stop her. She did not lift her voice. You took every tenderness offered you and treated it like weakness because you feared what you could not buy, she said. Look where that has brought you. The room went still. Then she gave Mercy Bluff the line it would repeat for years. A man who mistakes silence for surrender eventually tells his sins to the wrong, quiet woman. Even the judge smiled behind his whiskers. The ruling came by dusk. Fraud, conspiracy, accessory to murder, unlawful seizure, federal indictment for the San Jacinto partners above him. Silas's claim on Red House boarding void. His nearby assets frozen for restitution to miners' families and widows cheated through false transfer. Eleanor's ownership of the house, the spring lot, and the surrounding acreage confirmed outright. Complete. Not bruised. Not embarrassed. Destroyed. Mercy Bluff changed after that. Mrs. Keene sent pies. The barber's wife apologized. Porter slowly became a sheriff worth the leather. Widows came with folded papers Belle helped them read. Money long vanished began to return. Viola chose not to go back to Pueblo. She invested in Red House, saying a woman ought to place her money somewhere it might do more good than keeping a brood in cigars. Ruth turned the back parlor into a sewing room and discreet correspondence office for women needing legal help or travel onward. Belle stayed because there were ledgers to set right, and, to his surprise, because people liked him better when he told the truth. Jonah came and went with freight contracts and stories, always returning with ammunition, hard candy for Miriam, and a tenderness toward the house he refused to admit. And Elias? He meant to leave. Of course he did. Men burdened by guilt often mistake motion for purpose. The morning after the ruling, Eleanor found him in the stable tightening a saddle he did not truly want to cinch. Dust turned gold in the loft light. Leather creaked. A gelding thumped its tail against the stall board. You could stay, she said. For the girl? For yourself, if you remember you're included in the human race. That drew a laugh from him. Then his face grew serious again. I don't know how to belong anywhere without waiting for it to be taken. She stepped close enough to still his hands on the strap. Then start smaller, she said. Belong for one morning. Then another. He looked at her as if she had offered him something far more dangerous than shelter. What if I fail at that too? Her answer came quiet and unadorned, which made it all the heavier. You walked 3 days on bleeding feet to bring a child to safety. I figure you can manage one more hard conversation. Something yielded in his face then. Not weakness, not even relief exactly, but the weary beginning of trust. So he stayed for breakfast, then for repairs to the north fence, then for market day. By the first snow he had fixed the porch step he'd nearly crossed as a stranger, built Miriam a sled runner from ash wood, and taken the room at the end of the hall as if it had always been waiting for him. When federal men later came to ask whether Miriam might prefer distant cousins in Ohio, she answered for herself with flour on her cheek and certainty in her voice. No thank you, she said. My people are here. Years afterward, travelers still spoke of Red House boarding at the edge of Mercy Bluff, where the sheets were clean, the coffee strong, and the woman at the desk could sort the hunted from the dangerous before a valise touched the floor. They said women arrived frightened and sometimes left with work, papers, coin hidden safely in a hem, or simply the strange new habit of lifting their chins. In spring, when the creek ran high with snowmelt and the cottonwoods shimmered silver green, Eleanor would stand on the porch at dusk with Elias beside her and Miriam racing Rufus through the yard, and she would think how strange it was that the world had tried to break her in the very place where it finally taught her to begin again. Strange how the things you've given up on tend to find you. The last light rested on the red boards of the house and turned every window into gold. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf woman sent to a remote ranch because her family was ashamed of her, and the blind cattleman who saw her worth from the moment she stepped off the wagon.